What defines who we are? Is it our name, our actions, or something so small, so unique, that most of us don't even realize we have it, until it's gone? The year is 1878. Mist clings to the ground in the Belgian countryside, in a village so isolated that time seems to slow, still mired in the traditions and fears of the past. The smell of damp earth and peat smoke hangs in the air. Inside a small stone and wood house belonging to the Dupont family, the air is thick with the sweat and tension of childbirth. Elodie, the local midwife, a woman with a weather-beaten face and hands calloused from decades of bringing life into the world, finally holds the new baby. It's a boy, healthy, and with a vigorous cry that cuts through the tense silence. His mother, Cécile Dupont, sighs with relief on the straw bed. But Elodie's relief is short-lived. As she cleans the child, something is terribly wrong. She stops. Her blood, warm seconds ago, freezes in her veins. She rubs the baby's tiny fingers, hoping it's just a layer of vernix. But it isn't. The skin is perfectly, eerily smooth. Smooth as polished glass, like wet porcelain. She turns her small hands toward the flickering candlelight. There are no lines, no grooves, none of the intricate patterns she's seen on every other baby's palm for 50 years. Her own rough fingers glide across the child's skin without friction. A silent, primal panic settles in her chest. She thinks of ancient stories, tales of changelings, of children, exchanged by fairies, of devil's marks, or the absence thereof. She says nothing. With trembling hands, she wraps the baby tightly in a linen cloth, hiding his hands from his mother's view. She hands the child to Cécile, forcing a smile that doesn't reach her eyes. But the fear had already been planted. That night, in that dark room, a mystery was born along with the child. As the child, whom they named Mathieu, grew, the anomaly persisted. 2 years later, Cécile gave birth to a girl, Amélie. Elodie, summoned again despite her terror, confirmed the same condition: perfectly smooth fingers and palms. The Dupont family, simple peasants, now lived under a shadow of confusion. When a third child was born with the same characteristic, the midwife's silent panic became a terrifying certainty for the parents. They summoned the local physician, Dr. Benoit, a practical man more inclined to science than superstition. But even he was completely perplexed. He arrived in his wagon, carrying his worn leather satchel. He sat at the Dupont's kitchen table, adjusted his glasses, and examined the children's hands for hours under the light of an oil lamp. He used his strongest magnifying glass. He scratched his gray beard. He leafed through his worn medical textbooks, the pages yellowed with age. There was nothing, absolutely nothing in his books described an entire family born without papillary ridges. He muttered terms like congenital aberration and failure of development. But these were just words to mask his utter ignorance. The news, however, could not be contained. The doctor's own bewilderment fueled the rumors. The village, already a breeding ground for superstition, began to whisper. The Dupont children were different. They were not marked like the rest of humanity. What began as curiosity soon turned to fear. The condition was invisible to the casual eye, but knowledge, hers was toxic. At the local market, people stopped talking when Cécile approached. The other children were kept away from Mathieu and Amélie. What couldn't be explained was, by default, a curse. The Dupont family, having committed no crime, was slowly condemned to social isolation, becoming the village's outcasts, living behind closed windows. Inside the Dupont household, life became a fortress of secrets and painful adaptations. Fear of discovery dictated every action. Cécile and her husband, Jean, instructed their children from an early age. Never show your palms. Keep your hands closed. Wear gloves. Woolen gloves, even indoors, became a second skin. But secrecy had a practical, daily cost. The lack of fingerprints wasn't just a visual curiosity, it was a functional deficiency. The texture of our hands exists to create friction, to give us grip. The Dupont children struggled with the simplest tasks. Holding a glass of milk was a challenge. Their fingers slipped. Buttoning a coat was a frustrating ordeal. Jean, a carpenter, tried to teach his son to hold a hammer, but the tool slipped dangerously from his smooth hand. The world, for them, was made of slippery surfaces, and there was pain. Without the fine texture, sensitivity to heat and surface was altered. Cécile lived with her heart in her throat, dreading the smell of burning skin. More than once, one of the children placed a hand on a stove that was still hot, or picked up an iron pot that hadn't cooled sufficiently. The scream came too late, only after the damage was done, the skin red and blistered. The absence of friction was an absence of warning. The constant fear of discovery was, perhaps, worse. What would happen if one of them fell in the village square, and a neighbor, helping them up, felt their palm? That second of contact could ruin them. The secret was a physical and psychological burden, a constant weight on their shoulders. Frustrated by his own failure, Dr. Benoit decided to take a step that would change the Duponts' lives forever. In 1881, he wrote a detailed letter not to a local newspaper, but to his former alma mater, the prestigious University of Leuven. He described in precise clinical terms the Dupont phenomenon, a congenital and familial absence of dermal papillary ridges. The letter, seen by many as a provincial curiosity, fell into the right hands, or perhaps, for the Duponts, into the wrong hands. Dr. Antoine Régnier was a young and fiercely ambitious man. He was a physician, yes, but also a scientist of the New Age, fascinated by the emerging fields of comparative anatomy, physical anthropology, and the emerging theories of heredity. For Régnier, Benoit's letter wasn't about a suffering family, it was a map to uncharted territory. He didn't see a curse, he saw a golden opportunity. Fame, the possibility of publishing a paper that would shake the medical community. This was his chance to etch his name into the annals of science. He quickly secured a small grant from the university, justifying the research as a study of degeneration or unique hereditary traits. He packed his bags, not just with clothes, but with instruments, calipers, a leather-bound notebook, collection vials, and most intimidating of all, a large, heavy photographic equipment. He left the cobblestone streets of Leuven, with its gaslights and intellectual discussions, and traveled into the muddy, superstitious countryside, his heart pounding with the anticipation of a hunter about to find rare prey. Dr. Régnier's arrival was a seismic event, in the village. He seemed otherworldly with his dark city suit, polished shoes, and rapid, precise speech. To the Dupont family, he was a figure of authority and mystery. He introduced himself with clinical politeness, explaining to Jean and Cécile that he was not there to judge them, but to understand them. He used words they barely understood. Recessive trait, phenotype, empirical investigation. He offered them the first alternative to the word curse. He offered them the word science. Desperate for any explanation other than supernatural, they agreed. But hope soon gave way to profound unease. Their small house was transformed into a laboratory. Régnier was methodical, relentless, and utterly detached. He began his studies. He measured every inch of the children's bodies, not just their hands. He measured the diameter of their skulls with cold calipers, recording the numbers in his book. He made them stand naked while he sketched and wrote them down. He brought out the camera. The blast from the magnesium flash filled the room with blinding light and smoke, making the children scream in terror. But Régnier simply asked them to remain still for the next print. He collected skin samples, scraping their smooth palms with a small scalpel, making them bleed. He made plaster casts of their hands and feet, a cold, wet process that felt like a mortuary ritual. The family felt exposed, violated, like animals in a cage. They were no longer Jean, Cécile, Mathieu, and Amélie. They were the Dupont case. They were torn between the fragile hope of a cure or an explanation and the growing feeling that they were being used, objectified by the cold curiosity of a man who saw them only as an anomaly to be documented. Months passed, and Régnier's initial enthusiasm began to turn into palpable frustration. He had filled his notebook with data, but the data didn't form a clear pattern. The technology of 1878 was an insurmountable barrier. He proposed one theory after another and watched each one crumble. His first hypothesis was heredity. He drew a complex family tree, tracing the condition. It clearly ran in the family. Butes. What was this factor that passed from father to son? Without the knowledge of genetics, without the discovery of DNA that was decades away, it was a dead end. He then turned to the environment. Was it something in the well water? A toxin exhaled from the nearby swamp? He collected samples of water, soil, and even the Dupont's food. He took them back to Leuven for rudimentary chemical analyses. The results were inconclusive. There was no obvious poison. His final and darkest theory was in vogue at the time: degeneration. Some scientists believed that certain populations, especially rural and poor ones, were regressing evolutionarily. Was the absence of fingerprints a sign of this degeneration? A return to a more primitive state? But the theory didn't fit. The Duponts, despite their strangeness, were robust, healthy, and intelligent. They were not degenerates. Each failed theory increased Renier's frustration. For the family, it was torture. Each new test brought new hope, and each inconclusive result was another nail in his isolation coffin. As Renier's frustration reached its peak, an external event thrust the Dupont family into even more immediate danger. A minor crime occurred in the village. The local grocer's cash register was broken into during the night. The thief took only a few francs, but the act shattered the fragile peace of the community. The local gendarme, a man more accustomed to dealing with land disputes and drunkenness, was called in to investigate. He examined the crime scene, and on the cash register's polished wooden lid, he noticed something that disturbed him. It wasn't a clear fingerprint. The science of fingerprinting was still in its infancy and not formally used in rural Belgium, but rather a stain. An oily stain, a smudge left by a hand that, instead of leaving a pattern of lines, had left only a smooth, uniform trail. The gendarme had never seen anything like it. The whispers in the village, fueled by fear of the unknown and now by anger at the robbery, immediately focused on a single target. Who in the village didn't leave marks? Who had the devil's hands? Local paranoia, once a fog of superstition, became a storm of accusations. The gendarme, forced to follow the only lead he had, marched to the Dupont farm. He questioned Jean harshly. Jean, a proud man, was livid with rage and fear. How could he prove his innocence? The very nature of his family was now evidence against them. The absence of a mark was, in itself, a mark of guilt. Dr. Renier tried to intervene, explaining in scientific terms that the medical condition did not make anyone a criminal. But his words were lost in the wind. The incident highlighted a terrible truth. In a world that would soon rely on fingerprints to define identity and guilt, the Duponts were ghosts. News of the Dupont affair wasn't confined to medical circles or the village. Renier's letter, or perhaps the gendarme's rumors, traveled through other, darker channels. The story of the unmarked family reached the ears of a very different kind of businessman. A man named Silas, a flashy suit-wearing individual with gold teeth and a smell of cheap cigars and empty promises. Silas didn't run a laboratory. He ran a traveling cabinet of curiosities, one of those horror and wonder shows that exploited people with rare medical conditions for the entertainment of the masses. He saw dollar signs where Renier saw science. Silas traveled to the village and went straight to the Dupont farm. He didn't use fancy words. He used the universal language of poverty, money. He found Jane in the field, in a moment of particular desperation. The suspicion of theft had made it nearly impossible for the Duponts to sell their goods at market. They were on the brink of starvation. Silas made his offer. "The world will pay too, see?" he said, his voice greasy. "They won't mock. They will applaud. The smooth marvels of Belgium, I can make you kings." He painted a picture of a life far from the village that hated them, a life of travel, food on the table, and full pockets. To Jean, the offer was a diabolical temptation. He could feed his children. But Cécile was horrified. The idea of displaying her children on a stage, for strangers to pay to poke and look at their hands, was repulsive. It was selling her soul, her dignity. The Dupont home became the stage for an agonizing debate, a moral battle between the need for survival and the preservation of her humanity. Silas's visit and the moral dilemma it provoked seemed to break something in Dr. Renier. Perhaps he saw the ugly reflection of his own exploitation in the businessman's greedy eyes. Or perhaps, faced with the ethical criticism of his colleagues in Leuven, who questioned his intrusive methods, he simply decided the case was no longer worth the effort. His great discovery had become a scientific dead end and a moral quagmire. He could not prove his theories. The technology of 1878 had defeated him. The mystery was impenetrable. With a coldness that shocked even his already numb family, Renier began packing up his instruments. He made no grand announcement. He simply stopped coming one day. Months later, the family learned that he had published a short, vague article in an obscure university journal. The article was titled "Observations on a Familial Papillary Aberration in the Rural Area of B." He described the condition clinically, but offered no conclusions or answers. He had given their suffering a name, the Dupont phenomenon, and then abandoned them. For the family, it was the final blow. Science, the modern force that promised light, had withdrawn, leaving them in the same darkness of superstition, but now with the added scar of having been used and discarded. The farm gate closed behind Renier, and the silence that followed was heavier and deeper than any isolation they had known before. The years turned into decades. Life continued, as it always does, but for the Duponts, it took a darker, quieter path. Jean and Cécile grew older, watching their children grow into haunted adults, always hiding their hands, always living on the margins of society. Mathieu, Émilie, and their siblings had children of their own. And the condition, the silent mystery etched into their skin, was passed on to the next generation. The absence of lines became the family's secret legacy, a strange bond that bound them against the world. The 19th century gave way to the 20th. The outside world changed in ways the small village could barely comprehend. Science, which had abandoned the Duponts, advanced at a dizzying pace. Papilloscopy became a standard tool. Fingerprints became the undeniable signature of identity, the key to passports, criminal records, and employment. For the Dupont descendants, this new bureaucratic world was a nightmare. They were legal anomalies, people without fundamental proof of their own existence. The family's story became a whisper, a medical mystery lost in the archives. It would take more than 100 years. Only in the early 21st century, with the advent of genetic mapping, would science finally grasp the Dupont family mystery. Researchers would identify a rare mutation in a single gene, SMARCAD1, as the cause of adermatoglyphia. The Dupont phenomenon finally had an explanation. But for that family in 1878, caught between the superstitious fear of their neighbors and the impotent science of their era, there were no answers. They lived and died as a human enigma, a lasting testament to a mystery that defied the understanding of their time, their smooth hands forever outstretched like a silent question to history. If you were moved by this story, please like it, subscribe to the channel, and comment below on what you liked most. Your opinion is very important to us. Share this video with someone who needs an inspiring story. Until next time.